very much indeed. I apologise. I will be kind of using notes, so I'll be looking down a fair bit because as I start the thing, I say the talk I wanted to give today has morphed rather a long way from the original idea, and I found myself continually rewriting what I was doing and adding and subtracting bits all the way through. So to make sure I actually pick up all the elements I want, I've actually produced it in written format, so I'll be looking down at that from time to time. I know it's not good form, Colin. I apologise for not ending up getting glorious presentational material which I could just add lib to, but that hasn't kind of been the way it worked out. Indeed, it's all ended up rather different from our usual approach as well, which is that we tend to take a topic and we go away and look at it, and then we come back outlining an idea or ideas of how we might tackle that issue. Mine doesn't end up with how we might tackle it. It kind of ends up more with some open-ended questions, I think. But the idea arose because I was listening to the talk we had on Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, whatever that was now, 4, 5, 6 weeks ago. And the last one of which is sharpen the saw, as John's just said. And I reacted to that in an interesting way, or at least I think it was an interesting way. So, and then I found it brought back a week after that when we were talking about something entirely different. Someone then backed into sharpen the saw and actually used the phrase which had been what had triggered in my head the week before, which is, are we planning? Is that about planning to do something, or is it actually procrastinating because we don't actually want to get on with the doing? And that was actually how I reacted when we first had that 7th item, sharpen the saw. My immediate thought was, yeah, it's a good way of putting off getting on with the tree and go into the tool shed and start doing whatever. So that's kind of how I got into it. And I mentioned this to John in an exchange of emails, and he said he thought it was quite an interesting idea. I hadn't necessarily thought of it as a topic. And he said, because he discusses this with all his new clients, when they come in, almost amongst the first things he gets into is, let's look at how much you spend your time doing or thinking or planning or whatever. And nearly everyone thinks they're doing lots more than they are doing. And in fact, most of us are spending an awful lot of time thinking. Let's give it its nicest name. So he then says, well, why don't you lead a talk on it? So I said, okay, I would. And I thought I would call it planning versus procrastinating, because that was the original thing that made me sit up. But where do you start with a piece with a title like that? It's not like saying, let's look at Covey's 7 Habits and you go and get a summary of the book and show people 1, 2, 3, 4. Here was an idea, a very, very nebulous idea, and I wasn't quite sure where to kick it off. So the logical thing I thought was, well, I should go and read Mr. Covey's 7th Habit of Sharpening a Saw and really get into exactly what he was on about, and I could then pick it up from there. And I thought, well, no, that doesn't really work, because actually I just saw the title, Sharpen the Saw, which then triggered the thoughts sequence I had, which then wasn't about what he was talking about necessarily at all. It was, are we using it as a device to delay doing what we should be doing? So I didn't go off and read the book again at that point, but funnily enough, later, as the thing morphed his way and that, I thought, well, it might make sense to just have a look at and see what he was talking about. And of course, he wasn't actually specifically talking about sharpening a saw at all. He was talking much more about getting ourselves into better order so that we're in a fit state to do whatever it is we want to do. And he was a really broad definition of getting ourselves into order. But that wasn't the idea I'd been reacting to, and that wasn't really what I had in my head that I wanted to talk to. So I put that to one side. I didn't read the book at the beginning. So if you start thinking it the other way around, so what did I think he meant? He said, get the tool sorted so that you're ready to do a job. So I then think about, well, how do we plan for a job or a project? And we all know normal approach is to establish what's needed. That's always where we kick off, don't we? We determine which skills we need, how much time or money we need, what people we might need, and even which tools we might need, coming back to the original link. But preparation is usually needed, and we all think it's pretty good to do that. The real question I think John and I touched on earlier was just how much of it do you need, and how do you know when you're doing kind of not enough or too much? And we all know people who can research stuff seemingly forever. And I've seen it through a business life where people are doing it with either the prices of supplies, with the range of suppliers, with technical specifications, or even some elements of raw knowledge of the subject under debate. But there's always something we don't know. And so if we want, we can go off and clear that before starting. And I thought about this and I realized perhaps the reason I reacted negatively to the idea of going off to sharpen the saw is that I'm prone to doing the other thing. I launch into stuff which, if I stop to think, I would know needed some preparation. And most other people might well say, well, it's obvious you should have done some preparation. So then I get to what is the determination of what's the right amount? Is there such a thing? Or is it much more, as I came to think more and more, a matter of your personal makeup? You know, it's where you are in that subject. And then I started trying to unpick the elements that might impact on how individually we come to our decision of how much to do. So if I think about mine, I thought about where I could get some objective data about me. You know, I can sit and think about me all day long, and I know, you know, I continually, I suspect you do the same, never know whether what you think about you is right, wrong, or indifferent, and whether anybody else would think the same. So I thought, well, that doesn't kind of help me a great deal. So if I think about objectively what I'm like, where would I get that? So I then thought about the fact that I've had various analyses done through a working life. So I'll come to those in a minute. But I thought, well, I think subjectively, I could get, it seemed to me subjectively, my makeup has, amongst many elements, an impatient strand in it, which wants me to get going rather than thinking on. And in fact, I often tend to use the phrase fannying about for myself and others when I see them not getting on. So that's kind of the subjective end of how I think of it. So then I thought, well, how does that stand against others? So I thought, just to humor me for a minute, we might just have a quick hands up of kind of who's in the I would always do some planning mode almost automatically, as opposed to those who think of yourself as just let's get up and get on type people. And that again is purely subjective. So if, and let's think about it not so much in terms of a mega project worth millions, because obviously with that you just get into, well, obviously we're going to do lots of planning and we just have to work out how much. Think of it more subjectively about ourselves as individuals who sees themselves as the preparers, you know, who naturally says, yeah, I can't really start anything until I've really given it some thought and want to prepare and plan for it. John, you're one. Can we have hands up? Lorna, can you just help me catch the names? Yeah, okay. So we got, I know, 4.5, something like that, maybe. And what about just get up and do it, and we'll see what we need as we go along. 3, 4, 5, 6. Actually, so we got right, yeah. So with a few wavies in the middle, people are still going to work it out when they've heard from me as to what it is they're meant to be analysing. So that's kind of about half and half, I would say, relatively. And that may indeed be normally where it would end up, or maybe that's a reflection of the type of group of people we are in terms of, you know, entrepreneurs of one sort or another. But what are the elements within us that make us one side of this spectrum or the other? In the case of kind of how do we see ourselves as well? I thought of words like slow, careful, thoughtful on one side, maybe. The other side, you might say fast, impulsive, decisive, determined. Now, all of those words have positives and negatives in them, depending partly on where you sit. So, you know, if you're a fast mover, you tend to put thoughtful as possibly tending towards the negative. You'd like to think thoughtful's never a bad thing, but again, it's where you sit that makes you see these things as one side or t'other. So I said, as I said just now, I thought it'd be interesting to go off and look at something objective, you know, since I can't get anywhere usefully looking at myself and knowing whether I'm right or wrong on that. So I looked back at some what should we say, personality profiling and things of that sort, where people try and pick into your attributes and tell you, obviously they don't tell you they're good or bad, because we're all taught that there is nothing good or bad about us, they're just a mix of things. Each profiler dissects the various strands of our beings, and each collates the data differently, so we end up with a different perspective on who we are and what we are. Now, just going right the way back, in my case, at age 22, I went off to London to a careers analyst, because I didn't know what I wanted to do or be. And he wrote a report, which I still have, much to my surprise, because again, my filing is another whole interesting area that we can talk about another time, if you wanted to die of tedium. But of the attributes he refers to, is one of the things was, he said, strength was, I'm very interested in nearly everything. There are actually two elements I wasn't at that time. That's pure science and matters mechanical, as I put it. But everything else, across a whole range of spectrums of stuff I was interested in. And I now realize that the result of this is that I don't like spending hours doing any one thing, because almost invariably something will trigger a thought and I'll run off. Some would call this a propensity to boredom, I guess, and others might call it shallow. Well, whatever it is, it's me. The other thing that was interesting about that report from Careers Analyst is that most of it is still very, very obviously true today. So, 50 some years on, not a whole lot's changed, actually. So that I thought was just an interesting aside, because I hadn't read the thing again for about 30 or 40 years, I think. The other strands that came out of other analyses that I've had done later in life were an aggressive side and an unsympathetic side. I picked those two out because they lead me to feeling that I want to get on and not wanting to spend the time to take to listen to other views. Obviously, this is not a good attribute necessarily, but it is one I realize I've had most of my working life. And it therefore, I wonder whether that plays a part in the thinking that I need to get on, because the alternative is, amongst other things, I'll do some research and I'll go and listen to lots of other people, perhaps some of whom I'm not that interested in their views, rightly or wrongly. So that was another aspect of the personality side of this decision rather than an analytical side. Anyway, it's enough of me and my makeup. I've only made the points in order to sort of put in my position on the thing. But what I do think is that more I thought about it, it felt more and more like, yeah, this is what drives some of these decisions. It's my personality or our personalities rather than a thought through process. Generally with management, we like to think, well, if we can put a thought through process in place, we will do it better in future. And I keep coming back to the fact that we do it the way we do it because we are who we are. But this led me then to one other thought for John for another day. Maybe I should be trying to change myself, and maybe that opens up another discussion sometime, somewhere, where somebody looks at our ability to analyze ourselves, decide what wants changing, and say, what is the experience of anyone at changing themselves over any length of time? Or do we accept that we are who we are and that makes life interesting and enjoy it? Anyway, other aspects of the subject that struck me as I chewed it over was, where does fear of failure or fear of making mistakes sit? Is that fundamentally the driver as to why some people want to spend almost forever preparing and planning and thinking, because that weighs so heavily in their thought processes that they don't want to be in that place? And obviously, presumably the opposite of that is people who wander off and do things without the planning and obviously don't seem to mind or don't care what other people think, or maybe the decision wasn't that important. So obviously there's always underlying all of this discussion, the whole subject of how important is the thing you're planning to do. There's no doubt, obviously, the more important it is, the more significant it is, the more we want to get it right, I'm sure. But I think fear of failure is a part of this equation. Then, just to come back on something that John started with, yesterday in the LinkedIn write-up, John JB connected the talk to the time management book, 4-Hour Work Week by Tim Ferris, which I've never read. So I thought, thanks, John, that's, that's a nice one. So I had a quick look online and picked up the headlines of what he was talking about. And in there, he highlights in the video, which John did conveniently provide for me, so that saved me a bit of time. I appreciated that. He highlights three things. One is eliminate the inefficiencies, i.e. get rid of all the unnecessary stuff in your life. Logical, isn't it? If you want to use your time more efficiently. And he says, whilst in the now, do not use your time trying to keep up to date in all things. He said, you never can keep up to date with all things. There's much too much going on. Yet we all have a tendency to want to look to see what else has changed, what anyone new is thinking. And we can't know it all. And if we spend all our time doing that, then clearly we will have longer weeks than if we cut that out. He talked about that in relation to email management, knowledge in general, and skill sets. He said, obviously not illogically, focus on what must be done, not improving your mind as much, perhaps. And then the third one, which really did resonate with me, was outsource your life. Outsource more of your life. And that highlights another one of my beliefs that I had not brought into the debate till then. Wasn't sure it was exactly part of planning or procrastination, but it is to do with use of time without a doubt. And that is, you pay others to do jobs that you either don't want to do or will be inefficiently done by you. Again, it's interesting, isn't it? We generally accept that if it's something very technical and professional, like needing Stuart's expert advice on matters financial, we clearly have to go to someone who's an expert. We expect to pay them, we expect them to know it and give us the answers we need. No problem with that. As soon as it's something less than that, we think, well, I can do that. And if I do it, it's free. This other bugger wants £20 an hour or something. So why on earth would I want to spend my money doing that when I can do it? And of course, the growth of how-to videos on YouTube has absolutely exploded. And now the whole world and his dog wants to go on there and learn every bloody thing on the basis that that way they don't have to spend any money to someone who's already knows it. This is all totally opposite of me. But basically, who I am is that I would much rather use an expert to do it. And coming back to, the sharpening the saw, the cutting the tree, I could, of course, say, well, I'll go off and read something about what sort of saw I need, and then I can go and spend some time looking where I should buy it and save some money by finding someone who supplies it slightly cheaper. And then I can finally get it and try and look at the YouTube thing again about how I'm meant to use it. And then I can spend some time oiling it and cleaning it and making sure it's in beautiful condition to do the job. Alternatively, I could have picked up the phone and an hour later, my tree man would be round. He has all the kit. He knows exactly what he's doing. An hour later, he's chopped the tree down. He's taken the bugger away as well, which is another whole subject that we're left with when we do all our jobs ourselves. And I've got on with something else and I spent a bit of money, yeah. And obviously, if you don't have a penny piece, that's not one of life's choices. But in general, we do have that choice. And again, it's an interesting one of how far most people want to go to save money. My wife thought that was hilarious when I said I was talking about sharpening a saw. She said, you wouldn't even contemplate it. And I wouldn't want you up anywhere near a tree with a saw anyway, because you're undoubtedly going to kill yourself. So why don't you just call the tree man? Was exactly what she said first off, without any discussion of all the preamble that I've just gone through. So, and then lastly, I just draw one other point, and I realize I've rambled on a bit too long. Sorry about that. Not unusually, some would say. You have to, there is a thing about momentum. There's a thing about getting up and getting on and doing. And, you know, there's the saying about if a long journey has to start with the first step, and there are all those kind of anecdotal things. But I think a lot of people who spend a lot of time researching actually miss the point of momentum. There is something that's gained by getting on and starting and movement, as opposed to just sitting debating with yourself. And there are various examples which I could go through, but now in the light of the fact I realise I've talked too long, I'll cut them out. But, you know, a sat-nav in a car sets out the route, it gives you some alternatives, but until you start moving, it doesn't actually do anything very useful for you. And there was another one of a carpenter who ends up buying a beautiful set of tools, and in effect, he ends up never doing any carpentry. So he says he just decided he has a beautiful toolkit, which gives him a whole load of pleasure, which is fine if that's really what he wanted to do, but he hasn't become a carpenter. Anyway, I think those probably bring enough of the elements that I've found in thinking about it onto the table. And so I'll pass it back to John and let him run the rest of it.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. I got a new title for your talk. Don't fanny about.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's really pretty much my philosophy of life. Most people are doing much too much fannying about.
Okay, so I've written brilliant, brilliant. Throwing out a few things there. I've got some things hopefully